Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. So Dylan, Laura, we're thrilled to be here with you today. We love Diversio. We love the work that you all are doing through Diversio and are looking forward to this presentation. For those of you dialing in, welcome. Very glad to have you here. We're going to be talking through what companies can be doing to be more inclusive of Indigenous peoples. So by way of introduction, Laura McGee is the founder and CEO of Diversio, a people analytics company that uses artificial intelligence to help organizations become more inclusive. With offices in Toronto, New York, and London, Diversio was recognized by Fast Company as a world-changing idea, data and AI in 2021. Prior to Diversio, Laura was a consultant at McKinsey & Company with a focus on economic growth. She was named a top 25 woman of influence in 2017 and holds multiple board positions, including at Global Citizen, University of Waterloo, Ted Rogers School of Management, and Arcturn Ventures. She is a David Rockefeller Fellow with the Trilateral Commission. And Dylan Hopkins is a product manager and content designer at Diversio. She's studying systems design engineering at the University of Waterloo. Dylan has designed Diversio training toolkits, such as the Black Lives Matter toolkit and the Indigenous Allyship toolkit, which they'll be sharing from today. Prior to Diversio, Dylan has experience in product management, data and advanced analytics, and workflow design. So welcome, Dylan and Laura. We're excited to jump in with you today about what it means to be Indigenous. I know you'll be sharing some of the history of Indigenous cultures with us today, some innovation in Indigenous communities that you've been seeing, and what companies can be doing to be more inclusive. We'll also be going into some headlines from policy and current events and sharing some great resources.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a reminder, again, feel free to use the chat. We'll be taking questions and we'll also have some time at the end for questions.
Perfect. So I can jump right into it. Yeah, super excited to be here about talking about how we can create more space for Indigenous people today. So we can give a little bit more background about Diversio if you want.
Should we start with our land acknowledgement?
Oh yeah, we can go ahead with our land acknowledgement. So before jumping into today's discussion, we thought that it would be best to have an acknowledgement of the land that we are on today. If you're unaware of what a land acknowledgement is, it's basically taking a moment before a meeting or a gathering to acknowledge that the land that we are on is Indigenous territories. So we ask all of you joining in today in solidarity with Indigenous communities to reflect on the ways that the land and its peoples were and continue to be affected today by colonialism. So we ask you to consider the history of the land, relevant treaties. We ask you to invest time in educating yourselves about the names of the people that the territory belongs to, as well as invest time in learning about the history of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and forced removal exacted by colonizers. When possible, we also ask you to do your own research about how you can support Indigenous communities and leaders in your own region. So if you're looking to take anything back with you today and take land acknowledgements in your own meetings, we ask you to consider this quote by Lindsay Dupre of the Métis Nation. So as we engage in the process of reconciliation, it is critical that land acknowledgements don't become a token gesture. They're not meant to be static, scripted statements that every person must recite exactly the same way. They're expressions of relationship, acknowledging not just the territory someone is on, but that person's connection to the land based on the knowledge that has been shared with them. So today, I'm joining you from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, which is part of the Haudenosaunee territory and Anishinaabe land. If you're curious, and Laura is joining us from...
Yeah, thanks, Dylan. So I am joining from what is now called New York City, originally a part of the Lenape, Rockaway, and Canarsie territories.
So if you are curious about which territories you are on, I definitely encourage you to look up whosland.ca or nativeland.com to learn about the communities of Indigenous people around you and how you can do more to support them. So
Thanks, Dylan. And I realized I had you skip ahead, so I'm happy to kind of take a step back. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending. Thanks for joining us. I am the founder and CEO of Diversio. We are effectively a software and data company that is specifically focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we've seen consistently through our data is that Indigenous employees have so much to offer. They're incredibly productive, a great asset to any organization, and yet are often excluded and not provided the same opportunities as their peers. That obviously is a missed opportunity for everyone. And so our goal here today, and Dylan, our expert, has kindly put together some fantastic material, is to set the stage for almost some of the foundational basics that every leader can benefit from when it comes to Indigenous experience and history. And then my kind of small role at the end is speaking to how we as leaders can be allies. So how, what can we do tactically to create a workplace that is inclusive in really every way we can make it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, so jumping right into it, I think when we're talking about Indigenous inclusion and allyship, there are three main topics. So the first one being respect, the second one being educating yourself about injustices and inequalities that Indigenous people face today. And the third is remembering that despite everything, Indigenous people are resilient. So jumping into it, terminology and respect, in my opinion, kind of go hand in hand. And terminology is an important part in creating an inclusive environment for Indigenous people. I think a part of allyship is that we have to remember that throughout history, terminology used to identify Indigenous people has been damaging and rarely accurate. So Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous, Native, or Native American are all great terms, neutral terms to identify the larger group of Indigenous people in such a diverse community. So, however, when we're talking about a specific group or a country, it's important to remember that the preferred language is using the traditional names of that specified group. For example, on a personal note, I am part Anishinaabe and Métis, and so I use my traditional names to identify as being a part of the greater Indigenous community. So I think it's important to remember that using terminology is not about using correct terminology is not about being politically correct, but about being accurate and respectful. So if you're unsure what terminology to use, the best step forward is simply to ask the Indigenous person which terminology they prefer. So the next topic is about educating ourselves about current injustices of Indigenous people and the lived reality of what it means to be Indigenous today. So oftentimes when talking about Indigenous people, I think people tend to talk about suffering for Indigenous people in past tense. And I think it's important to remember that more than 61 Indigenous reserves in Canada lack clean and safe drinking water. Child mortality in Indigenous communities is 70% higher than the continental average in South America. There is a 40% gap in attainment of a high school diploma for Aboriginal people in comparison to non-Aboriginal people in Australia. And the average Native American person is 600 times more likely to contract tuberculosis due to a lack of healthcare. So through our journey through allyship, I think one of the most important steps is to take time and invest time in yourself to educate yourself and others about the current systemic discrimination and oppression that is happening today. And not only just educating ourselves, but also empathizing and learning how we can create a safe place for Indigenous people to come into work. So speaking of workplace culture, I think it's important to consider what it means to be Indigenous in today's workforce. And I think these statistics really paint a picture of kind of what it means. So 28% of Aboriginal people in Canada have felt discriminated against at work in the past year. 44% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers in Australia report hearing racial slurs in the workplace. 33% of Native Americans report being personally discriminated against because they are Native when it comes to being paid equally or considered for promotion. And 59% of Aboriginal workers in Australia have experienced racism based on their appearance, and almost a third feel their workplace is culturally unsafe. And I think the wording here and this statistic really hits the nail on the head for how Indigenous people are feeling in today's workplace. So the wording culturally unsafe really struck a nerve with me. And I wanted to kind of go into more what that means. So cultural assimilation is a term used to describe when a majority ethnicity or culture comes in and asks the minority culture to dilute themselves, their ethnicity, language, and culture to fit in with the dominant culture's way of life. And for Indigenous people, this carries a lot of intergenerational trauma due to the history of ethnic cleansing and colonization. So when asking employees to leave their culture at the front door when coming into work is very damaging, and especially damaging for Indigenous people's sense of belonging at work. And I urge us to ask ourselves, who is it benefiting to ask people to assimilate to each other? When asking Indigenous people or people from other cultures around the world to dilute themselves, it's diluting their diverse perspectives that create such a value addition to our teams and create diverse and unique team dynamics that create unique and diverse solutions. So although, these statistics are rather grim and there's a lot of inequalities and injustices that are happening around the world for Indigenous people, we have to remember that Indigenous communities continue to show resilience. So one part of Indigenous culture that makes it so unique and that I'm personally interested in learning more about is the diverse set of values that each community has. So respect for elders, environmentalism, and tradition are just some of the many values that are celebrated and are core pillars in Indigenous culture. So two of my favorite examples of communities coming together, finding solutions, and reconnecting with their Indigenous traditions are If Not Us, Then Who, and the Menominee Nation. So If Not Us, Then Who is a nonprofit organization that is looking to inspire environmentalism through Indigenous people and local communities. They're looking to create a network and use traditional knowledge to cultivate inclusive, impact-driven storytelling. Through the use of film and creating short films, they're looking to share Indigenous knowledge of the land and find ways to fight climate change and find solutions. The second example is the Menominee Nation, who found a solution to forest deconstruction by creating their own solution of sustainable forest management. Through the use of traditional knowledge to support forest biodiversity and reconnect with their land through cultural and spiritual ceremony, they have reconnected with the land and created a relationship with the forest. The Menominee's relationship to the forest motivates their ongoing leadership in addressing climate change. So again, despite all of the intergenerational trauma and history of oppression, Indigenous people are showing strength and leadership and continue to show strength and leadership throughout history. And Indigenous and Aboriginal leaders have demanded space in politics, literature, activism, film production, business, and many more. These are just a few of the many amazing Indigenous leaders around the world that have showed us to celebrate our Indigenous culture and create space for future generations of Indigenous people in leadership. And now I'm excited to pass it off to Laura to talk about how we can create inclusive environments in today's workplace.
Thanks, Dylan. Really appreciate that. I think your message around, look, there's absolute strength and resilience in this community reinforces the point that these are the kinds of people you want in your organization, no matter what the organization is. And nonetheless, there are things and barriers standing in the way of those folks being performing to their best potential. So I think the question for any business leader, for any CEO, frankly, for any employee is, what can I do to remove those barriers, create a sense of belonging? How can I be an ally? And so I think just taking a big step back here, when we think through what are the qualities of a leader that are the core enablers of inclusion and equity, at the end of the day, it all comes down to empathy. And so one thing that, we were discussing in our pre-call is assimilation. And why is it that that's still so common? Why is that still the norm, given that nobody really benefits? So the person being asked to assimilate, of course, feels like they've lost their sense of self. And the group asking for the assimilation is losing out on that diverse perspective. So how do you kind of get past that? What are the core steps that need to be taken? And at the end of the day, as a CEO, as a leader, it all comes down to empathy. And so understanding how your employees feel, having enough awareness and knowledge of the history and the challenges is the first step to starting to understand why those pieces of your employee self are so important. And one stat actually that Hannah, our colleague, has raised with me that I think is so interesting is that empathy is the thing that is most valued by employees, including prospective employees, which we all, are struggling to hire. So I think that's good to know. And yet it is cited as the thing that is most commonly missing from their leaders. So taking that first step of saying, I understand there's a problem here. Hopefully you have some data that's, tracking your employee experience. And I'm going to take it upon myself to understand, what the problem is at my company and how I can better identify with those who are not feeling their best. And I think what happens there, if you show that empathy and you truly are seeking to be educated and understand, is that you have a lot more room to be proactive than you might think. So for example, you spoke earlier about terminology. I think there's often a lot of fear that we see among leaders. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I use the wrong word? What if I accidentally offend someone? If you're coming from a place of empathy, you'll find that your employees are much more forgiving and really welcoming of that learning process. So I think there's two sides here. Number one is, as a first step, challenging your own assumptions, learn, listen. Being here is a great first step, I think. Keep working on yourself. So if you identify that you have an unconscious bias, so for example, if you think that a dress code should be enforced that runs contrary to what some of your employees might culturally like to wear, ask yourself, why is it that I'm enforcing that norm? Why is it that I feel so strongly that we should all dress in suits and ties, for example? I think building on that, step 3 is to act responsibly, support, uplift. I think you spoke, Dylan, of the great resilience that Indigenous people have demonstrated over time. That is an absolute strength and quality to be acknowledged, appreciated, and promoted throughout the organization. And so acting as a leader to support those perspectives and bring them to the forefront, best thing that you can do. And I think step 4 in being an ally and, appreciating that everyone's time is limited and constrained and we can't be an expert in all things, is start to understand the most important issues. Engage in a dialogue, instead of maybe watching season 3 of Succession, maybe there's an Indigenous film that you could put on to show a different culture other than New York City real estate. So I think those are 4 steps that you can take. Again, it's not about reinventing the wheel. It doesn't need to feel overwhelming. I think there are small baby steps that you can take as a leader that really start to change the dynamic in a company.
And I just want to chime in on this, Laura. I completely agree with this. I think you're hitting the nail on the head that it starts small, with these small acts of understanding, empathy. There's a lot of people listening who are tech entrepreneurs. Tech has a huge exponential impact on people that we never meet. And we have to innovate responsibly. There's more conversation around this. Just yesterday, General Catalyst, which is a big venture capital fund, released a new nonprofit entity that is focused on responsible innovation. So this is a theme that founders should be anticipating in the years to come. And it really does begin by starting small with our teams and our daily interactions. That has a big, broad effect with how we run our companies, the products that we're building, et cetera.
Yeah, and I'll even go a little bit off script here. So Dylan, we haven't spoken about this, but Dylan was responsible for leading product development in one of our, I would say, most innovative and most impactful products, which is the public data that we sell to investors, which help them identify what companies they should double down on and which they should screen out. And Dylan has a leadership style that's very unique to her, and it's incredibly effective. And people love working with Dylan. She's a very strong leader, and she is not necessarily what, you know, TV or the tech community would write down on paper as being the obvious product manager, but she did an incredible job. And I think it's on all of us to create the conditions for everybody, no matter their style, their background, their identity, to be able to showcase their strengths and really step up. So I think we feel certainly like this is not at our company the morally right thing to do. This is that plus great for our business. And I think Dylan is really living proof of that. Maybe Dylan, we can move on to the next slide.
And I do just want to mention to people listening, we're sharing some links in the chat to some of the things that we've been referencing and some of the resources that Dylan referenced earlier.
Awesome. Okay, so as you learn and listen, I think a few things to be thoughtful about. So we started earlier with a land acknowledgement. And this is something that when I began my journey in this space, I had heard now and then in different, especially government-run events, but I didn't frankly fully appreciate the significance of beginning presentations with that kind of statement. And so I think it takes like learning what you are acknowledging, frankly, to trigger that curiosity and trigger that desire to learn more about the cultures that exist on this continent that we may not be as aware of. So I think acknowledging that many of us are guests on this land and acknowledging, frankly, the history of others who came before us can really send a strong signal, especially if it comes from a place of learning. I think recognizing that many nations and communities exist, and this is a very, this concept tends to run contrary to how a lot of us are educated. And so it can be quite interesting, again, to think through other ways of perceiving the world and our place in it. And it can be quite mind-opening, at least in my experience. And so understanding our relationship with the land and recognizing that there are other ways to engage with it can be personally fulfilling, as well as, of course, respectful to Indigenous communities. And then finally, building on that respect piece. And I don't want to overemphasize a single anecdote, but respecting that there's different ways of dressing, there's different ways of engaging, there's different ways of negotiating, there's different ways of arguing, there's different ways of resolving disputes that can be incredibly effective. And so I think respecting the value of those differences can add a lot to your organization, a lot to your team dynamics. And sometimes it's as simple as, again, listening, learning, providing the safe space for those differences to be showcased, for you to say, you know what, there's something I'm going to take back. And there's something that we're going to really normalize through our organization so that we get really the best of all perspectives. And so a bit tactically, how can you as a leader ensure that you're recruiting, retaining, advancing Indigenous employees and contributors? I don't want to be like the boring business person about this, but targets can be very effective as a tactic. And so if you know that Indigenous representation within your community, for example, within your state, within your country is a certain percentage, set that as a target. If you want to be representative of your community, make it a non-negotiable that you're going to go out and find folks from that community, knowing again that that will strengthen your organization overall. Secondly, partnering with an Indigenous mentorship organization can go a really long way. I think we're at a point now where everybody is in a race for talent. It's hard to come by. And so to the extent that you can work with organizations that will, help you recruit and ultimately empower those folks in your organization, that can go a really long way to getting tactical on hitting those targets. I think third thing, and I think Dylan, you put it so well, being respectful of Indigenous cultural norms and avoiding cultural assimilation. Some self-education goes a long way there, like getting on Google and learning the history, watching some videos that we'll share a few examples, and then engaging with people on your team to understand, are there any signals that we're inadvertently sending? Is there any feedback that I'm not aware of as a CEO? Is there any bias or discrimination that's happening among your peers that we need to locate and basically unlearn, I think creating that dialogue one-on-one, again, can be quite effective. And I think, Dylan, you might have a thought here.
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of add on that even talking with elders in the community of Indigenous people about if you have questions, Indigenous people are so willing to share their culture and teach the people of today what traditions and ceremonies are impactful for Indigenous people. So I think that if you're ever curious, one of the best ways is just getting out there and talking to people and learning different perspectives.
Great point, Dylan. I think fourth thing here, and slightly different angle, but I think they both go together really well, is collect the data. So one thing that actually recently I've been disheartened to see, but I suppose at least it's honest to solve the problem, is there is a lot of Indigenous racism that's being reported in anonymous employee surveys that we conduct that managers and CEOs have no idea is happening. And it's a little bit like, as a parent, you don't always know how your kids are behaving. And I don't want to, compare business leaders with and employees with parents and children. But I think the point is you can't know all things that are going on at all times. And giving a safe space for people to, surface that discrimination is really, I think, a non-negotiable step if you're taking this seriously. So I think, again, educate yourself about common challenges and barriers, but also I would say educate yourself to what's going on under the hood of your own car. And then once you've done that and you're able to understand, are there any reports of certain types of language? That's the first step to, doing your duty as a leader and figuring out ways to stamp that out. And then final thing, I think a quick win is celebrate Indigenous Heritage Days. And I think that the kind of corollary of that is acknowledging days that we're typically celebrated as Eurocentric or North American heritage days that actually have a negative, extremely negative and justifiably so connotation for Indigenous communities. And so it doesn't always need to mean that there's a trade-off. And I think sometimes engaging with your employees and saying, hey, tell me about your experience and your feeling about this day. And then working to figure out how do we acknowledge it together is a place to start.
And just to double click on that, if I can, Laura, we have in point 5, the National Day of Mourning, which is Thanksgiving Day in the US. And there's a great Smithsonian piece on this to really understand what that means, what National Day of Mourning means. It sounds dark, sad, etc. But when you actually read these perspectives that the Smithsonian pulled together from Native Americans, it's less about that. They're getting together with families, celebrating Thanksgiving for the most part, but they want an honest acknowledgement of what happened. And it's about honesty. It's not to pull a dark cloud over this, what's become a national holiday for the most part. So I just think that's important also. It's just the transparency, honesty goes a long way.
Yeah, and if I can add on as well, just about Heritage Days and acknowledging Memorial Days, I think it's also important to consider mental health days as well for Indigenous people. I think it's important to have policies where people can feel safe in taking a day off to mourn their loved ones or their heritage and history of being Indigenous. So I think that's a key point that sometimes can be forgotten.
Yeah, excellent point, Dylan. And I think that speaks, and it's funny, I often see this with organizations. When you start to put in place policies that benefit a particular group for a specific problem, like that often reverberates. So providing mental health days and a sick bank is a great practice for Indigenous employees, and you'll find that other employees in your company take this up as well. And so the kind of, the outcome can be, the benefits can be felt well beyond that particular issue.
And I don't want to get into our discussion section too early quite yet, because I want to let you finish your presentation. But what you're saying sounds like taking a lens of allowing people to bring their whole selves to work. So with these policies, I mean, do you think this is the right sort of perspective and stance to take on it? We all have our backgrounds, our traditions, our cultures, our families, et cetera, in order to really be whole in those parts of our lives, which we're saying adds to your competence at work, adds to the diverse perspective you're bringing your way of identifying risks and opportunities for the business, you really need the freedom to develop yourself wholly outside of work. You know, do you think this is the right approach to be taking, especially for founders?
Yeah, I think that it's a good way to think about it. Bring your whole self to work and create a sense of belonging. I think that's really important. I think the other thing, and this might resonate with some of the tech founders in the room, like a lot of current norms and practices are simply path dependency. So somebody decided at some point this was going to be the norm, this would be the convention. We work 9 to 5, 2 days off a week, Monday to Friday you're in the office, this is the dress code. And when you really deconstruct those norms, like there's no business reason behind them. And in fact, there are business reasons supporting that should not be the norm. So for example, providing mental health days lets people recharge, lets people, address issues that need addressing, and people are grown-ups, they kind of know how to do that. And breaking dress codes, for example, make people feel more comfortable. And I myself am known to wear Lululemons more days than not. So it makes me more productive and I don't need to worry about what I'm wearing and I'm worried about the work that I'm performing. So I think a lot of it is like, allow people to feel that they belong, but also break rules that are not having a positive impact and are holding people back. Dylan, I'd love to know what you think here. Have I got that totally wrong?
Sorry. No, I completely agree that, even at Diversio, feeling like I can be my complete self and even admit, I am a part of the Indigenous community, but because of residential schools and things like that, I might not be the perfect, token Indigenous person. So I can celebrate, my own journey in relearning ways of my Indigenous ancestors. So I think that, coming in, being vulnerable in your workplace, feeling like it's a safe place to, show all parts of you, I think that really, creates a dynamic with you and your team that can push boundaries and create more diverse solutions for sure.
Yeah, and that vulnerability really goes both ways. And so one thing that, in the spirit of candor, when I was preparing my land acknowledgement, I didn't know how to pronounce the 3 territories that I'm now sitting on. And so I asked Hannah and Dylan, how do I pronounce these? And they directed me to the place to figure it out. Like, you don't need to know all the answers. I think it's okay to go to people and say, look, we're all fighting the same fight here. What can I do better? Here's my knowledge gap. I'll do my best to self-educate, but I would love your help if you're willing to. And on the flip side, please let me know what I can do to make your experience better and how I can behave and what conditions I can create. So I think it really is a give and take. And I think if a leader and their employees can crack that nut, all of the kind of friction and the worries about cancel culture, like all of that goes away because you've just created that dialogue. Great. I think, do we have another slide, Dylan, on resources? Oh, awesome. Maybe just to rewind for one slide, and I won't say kind of too much here, but some of you may be thinking as leaders, I want to self-educate, I want to be more aware, I want to be more conscious. Learning the entire history of Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island is quite a task. 4 issues I think that Dylan helped us identify to maybe start with. And they're loaded and they're complicated and they're nuanced, but I think something to start thinking about are things like self-determination, things like the disproportionate impact of climate change, and different perspectives maybe that we would really benefit from a non-Indigenous perspective. Things like land rights, things like women's issues are core topics I think that are certainly worth becoming more aware of in order to engage in conversations. And also, I think you'll find that the more we start thinking about these issues, again, diversity of perspectives, the more collectively as a society will begin to be able to create solutions. So I think it's really worthwhile. If you're going to deep dive, if you're going to spend time, this might be a place to start.
And I'll double down on that, Laura. In addition to becoming more aware of, but these things becoming part of the mainstream topic of conversation. Yeah. I think that one of the reasons we wanted to invite you all in to talk about Indigenous issues in particular is that we all, for our different intersectional identities, face unique challenges. And I do think there's not as much conversation around the challenges that Indigenous people or people who identify as Indigenous face in the workplace today. And of course, I'm using a broad brush here. It means something very different to be Indigenous in different parts of the world. But I think that it's time to put these issues on the table more visibly. And founders have the power to do that, and so do investors.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Courtney. And I think we'll finish maybe on the next slide, Dylan, with, where do I start? So Google helps, there's tons of top 10 lists and great Indigenous written articles about good resources, but here's a few to get you started. Articles, books, websites, there's some great, documentaries available. In Canada, there's, some government funded content that's actually pretty good, and some not so good. But I think if any, one thing I would maybe recommend, Courtney, I'm sure you're open to this. Certainly Dylan and I are open. If you're looking for recommendations, reach out to Diversio, reach out to 500 startups, 500 global rather. And I'm sure we'd be happy to send some your way.
Yeah, absolutely. We are running short on time, but so we'll skip some of the longer questions, but I do have a couple rapid fire questions for you if you have 2 to 3 more minutes, Laura and Dylan. And thank you for this wonderful presentation. If there's any lingering questions in the audience, feel free to submit them right now by chat. But if we could just do like a quick round of rapid fire. Dylan, Laura, and feel free, whoever can go first. If you have a book you recommend on Indigenous rights, and if that feels too narrow, just on diversity more generally, what would it be?
Dylan, you can go first.
Yeah, I'm trying to think at the top of my head. I've read a couple recent articles and books. One that I've read recently, just because I was curious, was the Anishinaabe creation stories. So this just kind of gave me a bit of more insight into values and traditions of Anishinaabe people. And it was, really beautifully written, and it had graphics that were designed by Indigenous artists. So if you can get your hands on that, I think it's really interesting to hear about. And, it is almost like a faith and a culture. So I think there's so much insight into environmentalism and learning about the land and cherishing, your family and traditions that are all kind of like hidden messages within these stories that have been told by ancestor to ancestor to ancestor throughout history. So that's probably the topic or the book that I would recommend.
Great.
I've got quite a nerdy answer. So I would start with Dylan's, but one thing that really got me, I studied American Studies in undergrad, and we read a series of articles critiquing the Last of the Mohicans, and basically how we had been educated to understand Indigenous culture and how so much of that had been overlooked. So I actually find, as much as reading books written by Indigenous authors, literature, nonfiction, etc., I think deconstructing your own understanding of what you have previously learned can go a really long way as well in terms of challenging your assumptions. And then the other kind of bit of a cop-out answer, I'm a big fan of like Wikipedia and Google. And I think like even those 4 issues, like one thing that I find, maybe it's my kind of personality and I'm a bit all over the place when I learn, but start with one topic and you'll find yourself drawn to the implications and the sources. And I find just exploring that and being thoughtful about who's writing the article can go, that's kind of how I like to learn.
Great advice. If you had to just off the top of your head, what's the biggest benefit for startups building diversity into their teams and boards early?
Yeah,
Dylan, do you want me to go?
I think Laura can start with this because she runs the company.
It's a big one, but like, where does your brain go?
I think 2 things. I think the sooner that you can build a diverse team, like the best. Said another way, the longer you wait, the harder it is. So I think being really thoughtful from the beginning, like we wanted a diversity of perspective. And then I think as soon as possible, survey your employees, get feedback, provide a safe space to do so. If you're too small and you're worried about people being identifiable, work with a third party if you need to, whatever it takes to kind of get that candid feedback. Because even I'm surprised when we survey our team. I'm like, there's always 3 or 4 things, and I'm like, I had no idea. And they can be positive things as well. So that would be my.
Thanks for sharing that. And Dylan, do you want to take a stab on this one?
I mean, I can add on. I think that, like we've kind of emphasized throughout this, is just having empathy for everybody around you and just being able to have an open ear to any sort of, issues that anybody is having, and just kind of being aware of any societal issues that are going on within different groups. Something that happened over the summer while I was working at Diversio is we found out about the residential schools in Kamloops and all of the Indigenous children that were found. And what I really appreciated is, Laura's counterpart, Anya, reached out to me and she called me and she said, "Hey, Dylan, listen, just heard the news. If you need to take the day off, absolutely take it. This is like so messed up, everything." And that just really resonated with me. And because I've never been at a company, that cared so much about each of their employees. And I think that's what really makes a difference for your employees, is just being in touch.
Awesome. That's a great example. Last one, what keeps you both optimistic about this work that you're doing at Diversio?
I guess for me, I think it's the number of companies who are afraid of what they're going to find, but are willing to go to their employees and say, "Please tell me honestly what's going wrong, and we'll figure out how to fix it." I think the number of companies that are saying, we're going to tie executive bonus to improving your experience. We found a way to quantify it. And so that means something to our bottom line. So I think as that accountability grows, and as we find different ways to quantify problems, I think then, that allows us to maybe move forward in the current construct, which is not always ideal, but at least it's somewhere to start. I don't know, Dylan, what you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I think that you summarized that amazing.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for being with us today. It was great to hear from you, and thanks for this presentation, and thanks to those of you who joined.
Thanks, Courtney.
So much.
Take care, Dylan and Laura.